He could hear them calling his name, so close that the sound vibrated in his chest, and for one reckless second, he almost ran toward it, almost left the tree that was keeping him alive, but the wet snow had begun to fall harder on the mountain, and the light was draining out of the sky. And 9-year-old Ethan Walker understood something no one had ever explained to him. If he moved now, even one wrong step, the search would tighten in the wrong place, and he would vanish between their voices. February 17th, 1981. Palomar Mountain, California. The air sharp with damp cold and the sky heavy with a storm that had not yet decided whether to commit, and Ethan Walker did not disappear in a dramatic way. He simply stepped off a familiar nature trail for what he believed would be 10 harmless seconds, a shortcut to win a small race against his older brothers. But the ground was slick from earlier drizzle, pine needles sliding under his boots, and when he dropped into a shallow drainage that looked like an easy crossing, he expected to climb out onto the trail within moments. Yet when he reached the other side, the path was gone, replaced by trees that stood too evenly spaced, too similar, as if the mountain had quietly erased his mistake and left him alone with it. He turned immediately, certain he could fix it, certain that retracing steps was simple, but the slope now offered 2 directions that felt identical, and choosing quickly felt braver than stopping. So he climbed toward what seemed right, pushing through brush that caught at his sleeves, feeling the first small sting of doubt when the ground did not level into the packed dirt he expected. And when he stopped again to listen, the forest answered only with wind moving high above him. The kind of wind that sounds distant and unconcerned. And that was when anger came first. Not fear. Anger at himself for leaving the trail. Anger at the trees for looking the same. Anger at the silence that followed his first tentative call of his brothers' names. Back at the campsite, Laura and Mark Walker were still laughing at first, assuming he had circled around, assuming he would appear from behind a trunk with a grin. But laughter thinned quickly into confusion, then sharpened into something colder, and within minutes their voices were cutting through the trees with urgency, drawing the attention of a nearby ranger who asked calm, precise questions while scanning the slope, and radios were lifted. Boots began moving outward in widening arcs, and the sky, almost on cue, released the first slow flakes of wet snow that clung to jackets and darkened the soil. Ethan felt that change in the air immediately, the way damp cold settles into fabric and refuses to leave, and he finally did what pride had kept him from doing before. He stopped walking because each step now felt less certain than the last, and somewhere in the back of his mind he remembered a simple rule from a school safety talk. If you are lost, stay where you are. Let them find you. And the advice had once sounded childish. But here, with the light already fading earlier than it should, it felt like the only stable thing left. So he chose a thick pine trunk, pressed his back against it, pulled his knees up for warmth, and told himself in a whisper that trembled despite his effort to steady it, I am staying here. Even as the temperature began its quiet drop, and the search line unknowingly shifted just beyond his sight. The whistle sound hangs in the air for less than a second before the wind tears it apart, and Ethan waits for an answer that does not come immediately, which is worse than silence, because now he knows someone might be near, might have almost heard him, and that thin possibility is heavier than being completely alone. He presses his back harder against the pine, feeling the bark through his jacket, forcing himself not to stand too quickly, because the slope below him has grown darker, slicker, and every exposed root now looks like a trap waiting for one rushed step. The snow thickens slightly, no longer drifting but settling, layering over his earlier footprints, softening the disturbed ground he cleared beside him, erasing evidence that he was ever there, and the realization hits him slowly. The longer he waits, the cleaner the mountain becomes. He scrapes at the soil again with his boot, widening the dark patch, exposing damp earth beneath the white, but his fingers feel clumsy when he reaches down to help, and he pulls them back quickly when the sting of cold bites deeper than before. Somewhere uphill, a voice calls his name again, closer this time, but it bends strangely between the trunks, echoing in a way that makes distance impossible to judge. He almost answers immediately, almost shouts with everything left in him, but a sudden gust surges through the drainage, carrying snow sideways and drowning sound under movement. And he realizes if he wastes his voice now, the next attempt might come too late. Timing is everything, and timing is invisible. Below the slope, searchers pause, uncertain, one volunteer insisting he heard something, another unsure whether it was wind-snapping branches. The ranger studies the terrain with a flashlight, beam cutting across uneven ground, knowing children often follow gravity when lost, knowing also that if the boy has kept moving, they could be scanning empty forest by now. The line hesitates for just long enough to feel dangerous. Ethan lifts the whistle again, but this time his hand trembles so badly he has to steady it against his chest, and he counts under his breath, waiting for the wind to die for even half a heartbeat. The forest does not fully quiet, but it softens just enough, and he blows once, sharp and desperate, the sound slicing through the moving air, and this time, through the snow and the dark and the uncertainty, he hears boots change direction, but they are still not close enough. The flashlight beam slices through the snowfall again, closer now, so close that Ethan can see the dust of white flakes glowing in its path, and his heart begins to pound so violently he is afraid the sound alone might give him away. Yet the beam passes over him by inches, too high, too fast, scanning the upper contour of the slope while he remains tucked in the darker crease of the drainage. And in that single sweeping motion, he understands something terrifying. They are searching correctly, but not precisely enough. He forces himself not to stand, not to wave, because the ground beneath him is softening, wet soil shifting under the new weight of snow, and when he adjusts his right foot even slightly, the earth crumbles and slides a few inches downward, just enough to tilt his balance and send a pulse of fear through his chest, and he grips the pine trunk harder, bark scraping into his palms, knowing that if he slips fully, the noise alone could pull the searchers in the wrong direction or worse, carry him deeper into a place where the beam will never land. Above him a voice calls again, stronger now, repeating his name with urgency, and for a moment the sound feels almost within reach. But wind bends it sideways, distorting distance, making it impossible to tell whether they are 20 yards away or 50. And Ethan hesitates with the whistle at his lips because timing is everything, because blowing too early or too late could mean they pivot again, could mean the line shifts away before realizing how close they truly are. Snow thickens, not dramatically but steadily, soft flakes turning heavier, sticking to his sleeves, melting and refreezing against fabric that is already damp, and the exposed patch of dark earth he cleared earlier is nearly gone now, swallowed under a thin white layer that erases contrast, and panic whispers that the mountain is quietly resetting itself, removing the only signs that he ever sat here waiting. He draws a breath, deeper than before, steadying his shaking hands against his chest, waiting for the wind to break just once, and when the air stills for a heartbeat, he blows a single long note, not frantic, not scattered, but controlled and sharp. And this time the response is immediate. Boots shifting direction, a beam cutting lower along the slope, closer than ever before, but still not close enough to touch him. The beam drops lower this time, cutting across the drainage instead of the ridge, and Ethan sees it flick over the disturbed snow inches from his boots before sliding past again. And the closeness is unbearable, because being almost seen is worse than being unseen. It sharpens every nerve, tightens every muscle, and he feels his control slipping as his body shakes harder against the cold and the pressure of the moment. He tries to stand again, slowly, carefully, one hand gripping the pine, but his left leg trembles violently and the wet ground shifts under his weight. A subtle slide that steals several inches before he catches himself, bark tearing slightly under his fingers, and he realizes with a sudden, sobering clarity that if he fully loses balance now, the noise and motion could carry him below the search line, into darker ground where the beams will not reach tonight. Above him, the ranger's voice grows sharper, directing the volunteers to tighten formation, to scan lower, because the whistle clearly came from below the contour they first suspected, and boots begin descending in measured steps, cautious but faster than before, and Ethan hears stones dislodge under their weight, hears the careful rhythm of controlled movement, and hope rises again, dangerous and bright. The snow continues to build, thin but relentless, settling on his shoulders, melting into the fabric and pulling heat from his skin, and he feels the first dull heaviness creeping into his thoughts, the kind that makes stillness feel easier than action, that whispers he has already done enough. But he fights it, blinking hard, forcing himself to stay alert, because this is not the time to drift inward. He raises the whistle once more, waits for the wind to dip, and blows 3 sharp bursts that echo cleanly through the trees. And this time the response is immediate and undeniable. Flashlights snapping toward him in unison, beams converging, a voice shouting, "Hold your position," close enough now to feel real. Yet the slope between them remains steep and unstable, and until boots stand directly in front of him, until hands reach through the falling snow, the mountain still holds him in its grip. The flashlights lock onto him at last, not drifting, not guessing, but fixed. And for one blinding second Ethan feels exposed in a way that is almost frightening, because the beams erase shadow and leave nowhere to hide, and the ranger's voice cuts clearly through the snowfall. "Don't move," firm and controlled, close enough now that Ethan can hear breath between words, yet the ground between them is still unstable, still slick with wet snow that shifts under every step. 2 volunteers begin descending toward him in a slow, diagonal approach. Boots angled carefully into the slope to avoid triggering a slide, and Ethan tries to remain perfectly still as instructed. But his body trembles uncontrollably now, not just from cold, but from the long strain of waiting, and the pine trunk at his back no longer feels solid. It feels small, as if it cannot fully shield him from gravity or from his own exhaustion. Halfway down, one rescuer's foot sinks unexpectedly into softened soil, not a fall, but enough to send a ripple of loose snow cascading downward, brushing past Ethan's boots and reminding everyone how fragile the terrain has become. And the ranger immediately calls for spacing, for slower steps, for patience, because rushing the final yards could undo hours of careful searching. Ethan's vision flickers slightly at the edges, dark spots drifting in and out as warmth drains from his fingers and toes, and he fights the instinct to close his eyes, to let the shaking settle into stillness, because he understands dimly that staying conscious is now part of staying alive. And he grips the whistle one last time, not to blow it, but to feel something solid and real in his hand. The nearest rescuer is only a few feet away now, arm extended but not yet touching him, waiting for stable footing before committing weight forward, and in that suspended moment, with snow falling thicker and the slope still threatening beneath them, the distance between seen and secured remains painfully small, and until that final step is placed without slipping, Ethan is still on the mountain. The rescuer's glove is still hovering inches from Ethan's sleeve, close enough that Ethan can see wet snow melting on the black fabric, close enough that his whole body wants to lean forward and end the distance. But the ranger keeps repeating the same command, steady and hard. Don't move, because the slope is a thin crust over slick needles and soft soil, and one careless shift could send both child and rescuer sliding together. And Ethan understands that being found is not the same as being held. Not yet. Not on a mountain that punishes impatience. A flashlight beam tightens. Another swings wider to watch the ground. The volunteers reposition like chess pieces. One step, pause, test. Another step, pause. And the smallest sounds become enormous. The grit of snow under a boot, the snap of a twig, the breath pulled in sharply through cold teeth, and Ethan's legs keep trembling so hard the motion feels like it belongs to someone else, the shaking making the pine trunk behind him thrum faintly against his spine, and he presses his palms flat to the bark, trying to become part of the tree, trying to be still enough to be safe. The wind shifts again, not a roar, but a steady push down the drainage, and it carries loose snow that drifts into the flashlight beams like smoke, cutting visibility at the worst possible time, and the nearest rescuer freezes mid-step, boot half planted, half searching for purchase, and the ranger immediately calls for a different angle, a diagonal approach from slightly higher ground, because the direct line is too slick, because the soil near Ethan's boots has already begun to crumble, and Ethan watches a thin ribbon of wet earth slide a fraction of an inch. Slow, almost polite, yet threatening all the same. Behind the search line, Laura's voice breaks through once, sharp and pleading. "Ethan, baby, stay with them, stay awake." And the sound hits Ethan like heat, like pain, because it makes him want to answer, to shout back, to prove he is here and listening. But the ranger raises his hand for silence, and the volunteers obey instantly, because echoes can lie, because one wrong call can pull attention uphill. And Ethan swallows the words he wants to say, tasting cold air and fear, forcing himself to breathe through his nose the way he was taught to calm down in school, slow in, slow out, counting to keep his mind from drifting. The rescuer on Ethan's left finally plants a boot on a root that holds firm, and he shifts his weight carefully, inch by inch, lowering his center of gravity, extending both hands now, not grabbing, not yanking, just offering a stable point, and Ethan starts to lift his own hand toward it, then stops at the ranger's sharp warning. Not yet, because the moment a child leans forward, the slope changes, and Ethan freezes again with his arm half raised, suspended between relief and terror, while the snow keeps falling and the mountain keeps waiting, and the distance between seen and secured stays painfully, dangerously small. For several long seconds no one moves. Not Ethan, not the rescuer with both hands extended, not even the ranger who studies the slope with a calculating stillness, because the mountain has shifted again in tiny, almost invisible ways. The wet snow compacting under boots, the softened soil near Ethan's left foot sagging another fraction, and everyone understands without saying it that the next motion must be perfect, or the drainage will claim its advantage. The ranger changes the plan in a low, controlled voice, instructing the volunteer above Ethan to anchor himself against a thicker trunk, to create a human brace rather than risk a direct pull. And the adjustment takes precious seconds, boots repositioning carefully, weight redistributing across the incline, while Ethan feels the tremor in his legs growing worse, the shaking no longer voluntary, but a deep, exhausting vibration that makes his vision pulse faintly at the edges. Snow continues to fall in steady silence, not heavy enough to blind, but constant enough to erase contrast, and the dark patch of earth beside Ethan is gone entirely now, smoothed into white, leaving only his small shape against the trunk as proof he exists here. And he realizes with a chilling clarity that if the light shifts away even briefly, if wind swallows their sightline again, he could become shadow once more. "On 3, the ranger says quietly, not to Ethan but to the team, and Ethan hears the numbers in his head before they are spoken. 1, a rescuer planting his boot deeper. 2, another tightening his grip on the tree behind him, and Ethan forces himself not to lean prematurely, not to collapse forward into the promise of hands that are almost within reach, because he remembers the command, "Don't move," and discipline has carried him this far. 3. The rescuer steps the final controlled inch, locking his stance against the anchored volunteer, and this time when he extends his hands, there is no hesitation, no shifting ground beneath him, and Ethan lifts his own arms slowly, deliberately, feeling the cold pull at his muscles as if the mountain resists the transfer, and for one suspended heartbeat their fingers brush but do not yet secure, the connection fragile, incomplete, and the slope still waiting to decide whether it will release him. Their fingers finally lock, not in a dramatic pull but in a tight, deliberate grip, glove against numb skin, and the rescuer does not yank him upward, does not rush. He simply holds him there for a full second to test the slope, to test the balance, to make sure the mountain will not answer with a sudden slide, and Ethan feels the difference immediately. The shift from being alone against gravity to being connected to something stronger. "Lean into me," the rescuer says quietly, and Ethan obeys inch by inch, transferring weight forward, while keeping his boots planted as long as possible, because lifting them too fast could break the fragile stability they have built. And behind the rescuer, the anchored volunteer tightens his stance against the tree, acting as counterweight, while the ranger watches the ground instead of the boy, eyes fixed on soil and snow for any sign of collapse. When Ethan's boots finally leave the unstable patch and press onto firmer ground closer to the search line, a thin sheet of wet earth slides away from where he had been sitting. Not a dramatic collapse, but enough to confirm how narrow the margin was, and a quiet, collective exhale moves through the team. Not relief yet, not celebration, but acknowledgement that the most dangerous inches are behind them. They do not stop there, because standing in the drainage is still exposure, still risk, and the rescuer keeps one arm around Ethan's shoulders while guiding him diagonally upward toward thicker footing. Each step tested before weight is committed, flashlights adjusting to cover both the boy and the ground ahead, snow continuing to fall steadily as if nothing significant has shifted on the slope. Only when Ethan's boots reach the packed surface of the higher trail do the rescuers change posture, straightening slightly, securing both arms around him instead of hovering hands. And though he is still shaking and the night is still cold and the descent to safety has not begun, something essential has changed. The mountain no longer holds him alone, and for the first time since he stepped off the path, his balance depends on more than his own strength. The moment they reach the higher trail, the wind feels stronger, less blocked by the drainage walls, cutting sideways through jackets and lifting loose snow into sharp spirals that sting exposed skin. And though Ethan is now held firmly between two rescuers, his legs no longer trusted to move alone, the danger has not ended. Because the trail itself is glazed with wet accumulation that hides slick rock beneath a thin white layer, and every step toward the trailhead must be measured as carefully as the descent was. The ranger shifts formation immediately, placing one volunteer several yards ahead to scan the ground with a lower beam, searching for ice patches and unstable edges, while another falls in behind to guard against any backward slip, and Ethan feels the coordinated movement around him like a living structure, human anchors adjusting to terrain, yet his body is growing heavier by the minute, the shaking now mixed with a dull fatigue that makes it harder to lift his boots even when guided. Laura's voice comes from behind the line, steadier now but still edged with strain, and she is told to stay back until they reach flatter ground, a command she obeys only because she sees the slope under their feet and understands that one misstep from her could ripple through the formation, and Mark walks parallel at a careful distance, scanning instinctively for hazards, unable to fully release the fear that something could still interrupt the fragile chain carrying his son forward. Halfway along the narrow trail, a hidden patch of ice reveals itself without warning under the lead volunteer's boot. A sudden sideways slide that he corrects quickly, but not before the team feels the shift travel backward, and the ranger calls for a full stop, tightening grips, lowering centers of gravity, and Ethan senses how quickly stability can unravel. How even now, within sight of the distant headlights flickering through trees below, the mountain retains small, sharp ways of reminding them that nothing is guaranteed until solid ground is reached. They adjust again, shortening the spacing, moving slower, boots angled deliberately, and the trailhead lights grow brighter through the branches with every careful step. Yet no one relaxes. No one speaks casually, because the last stretch is often where people make mistakes, where relief dulls attention, and until Ethan's boots stand on flat gravel and the slope falls away behind him, survival remains unfinished, balanced on deliberate movement rather than hope. The final stretch to the trailhead feels unreal. Not easier, just flatter. The slope easing into packed gravel that crunches under careful boots. And when Ethan's feet finally touch level ground, the rescuers do not let go immediately. They keep their grips firm until they are certain his weight is stable, until the tremor in his legs no longer threatens to fold him back toward the dark incline behind them. And only then does the ranger give a short nod that passes through the team like a silent confirmation. The mountain no longer has leverage. Laura reaches him first once the formation opens, dropping to her knees on the cold gravel and wrapping both arms around him without pulling, without shaking him, just holding him steady as if she understands instinctively that he has been fighting gravity, fear, and cold for hours. And Mark places a hand over both of them, not speaking at first, because words feel too small compared to the thin margin that separated this moment from something else entirely. The paramedics move in quickly but calmly, checking his pulse, his temperature, asking his name, the date, simple anchors to confirm he is fully present, and Ethan answers in a thin but steady voice, each response clearer than the last as warmth from blankets begins to seep into his jacket. And when they guide him toward the waiting ambulance, he looks back once toward the dark tree line, toward the drainage that nearly erased him, and he realizes how little distance there truly was between being lost and being unreachable. As the doors close and the engine starts, the headlights illuminate the falling snow one final time, and the ranger stands watching the slope for a moment longer, replaying the angles, the timing of the whistle, the decision to search lower first, knowing that if the boy had moved uphill chasing echoes or downhill chasing fear, the search might have stretched into a colder, longer night, and that the smallest choice, to stay against one pine tree, altered everything. Inside the ambulance, Ethan leans back against warm padding, exhaustion finally allowed to settle now that survival is no longer a calculation but a certainty, and he understands in a quiet, lasting way that courage was not running or shouting or trying to be brave. It was stopping when stopping felt wrong. It was waiting while the snow fell and the light faded, trusting that being still could be stronger than moving. And as the vehicle pulls away from Palomar Mountain, the night closes behind them without drama, without ceremony, leaving only the knowledge that survival is often decided in the smallest, hardest moments when no one is watching. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.